I always thought living on a large piece of land out in the countryside would spare me from the drama and nonsense that usually comes with suburban neighborhoods, but it turned out that drama has a way of finding you no matter how far you go. My farm sat on 30 acres of open pasture with a big red barn I had restored myself, complete with the old sliding doors that gave it character and a rustic charm. Those doors weren't just for looks, they were the main entry for my tractors, balers, and the equipment I needed every day. So you can imagine my irritation when about 6 months after new neighbor moved in down the lane, I came out one morning to find a shiny, brand new Bentley parked directly in front of those barn doors, completely blocking me in. The neighbor in question was Karen, a woman who had already made quite a name for herself in our small HOA. From the moment she arrived with her mansion like house, elaborate fountains, and three yapping little designer dogs, she carried herself like she was royalty, and the rest of us were peasants living to serve her. She had complained about my rooster crowing at dawn, filed petty noise complaints about the sound of my tractor in the evenings, and even had the audacity to show up uninvited to one of our HOA meetings demanding I paint my barn a classier color, since red apparently offended her delicate sense of aesthetic. At first, I tried to be civil. I brushed off her rudeness, ignored the little dig she made, and even offered fresh eggs as a peace offering once, which she refused with a disgusted look on her face like I'd handed her garbage. But parking her luxury car in front of my barn door was the last straw. It wasn't just inconvenient, it was deliberate. No one accidentally pulls up a gravel drive that clearly leads to a barn, ignores the no parking, farm equipment access required signs, and then leaves a car parked sideways across the doors. She knew exactly what she was doing, and I could almost hear her smug little laugh in my head as I stood there staring at the massive shiny block of metal obstructing my day. I had hay that needed hauling, livestock that needed tending, and a schedule to keep. Farmers don't have the luxury of waiting around for someone to move their toy car. I tried knocking on her door first, even though it was a good quarter-mile walk down the road. No answer. I called her cell straight to voicemail. And as I stood there, sweat building under my hat and irritation boiling in my chest, I realized that this wasn't an accident or a simple misunderstanding. This was Karen trying to prove a point, some twisted power move to remind me that she thought she was above the rest of us. I trudged back to the barn, glancing at my tractor, the big green John Deere I relied on daily, and that's when the idea hit me. If Karen wanted to test me, then fine. I wasn't going to waste my day waiting for Her Majesty to grace me with permission to use my own barn. I climbed up into the tractor cab, turned the key, and listened to the deep rumble of the diesel engine come to life. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I looked out over the hood straight at that Bentley, polished to a mirror shine, sitting like a smug little roadblock between me and my livelihood. "You brought this on yourself," I muttered. With the kind of slow, deliberate precision only a farmer can muster, I eased the tractor forward, the wide tires crunching over the gravel until the metal bucket pressed up against the back of the Bentley. I gave it one little nudge, just enough to hear the alarm scream to life, like a banshee wailing. Then I pushed harder. The tires dug in, the engine roared, and with a sickening crunch of metal and shattering glass, the Bentley's sleek frame buckled beneath the raw force of farm machinery. The car squealed like a dying animal as I shoved it forward several feet, completely flattening the rear end and leaving it mangled in the dirt like a discarded soda can. The alarm wailed, birds scattered from the trees, and I swear even the cows turned their heads to watch. By the time I stopped, the once pristine car was an unrecognizable wreck, the kind of damage no amount of insurance could fully cover. I killed the engine and stepped down from the tractor, brushing the dust off my jeans as I looked at my handiwork. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of peace. Karen had been poking the bear, and now she finally learned the bear bites back. The satisfaction of watching that shiny status symbol reduced to a crumpled heap didn't last long because I knew Karen, and I knew she wouldn't take this lying down. If anything, I had just declared war, and she was the type who fought dirty. Sure enough, not 20 minutes later, I heard the screeching of tires coming up my gravel drive, and there she was in a second car, a pearl white Range Rover this time, pulling up so fast she nearly lost control on the turn. She jumped out before the vehicle had even come to a complete stop, her oversized sunglasses perched on her head like a crown, and her perfectly manicured nails waving around dramatically as she screamed, "What have you done? To my CAR?" Her voice carried across the field like a tornado siren, shrill and furious, enough to make the chickens scatter. I leaned against the tractor, calm as could be, and said, "I moved it so I could do my work. You parked it in front of my barn." Her face turned scarlet, her jaw dropped, and for a moment she just gawked at me like she couldn't believe I'd dare speak back. Then she launched into a tirade about how her Bentley was worth more than my entire farm, how I had no respect for luxury, how she would sue me into bankruptcy, and how the HOA would be hearing about this immediately. I let her rant, watching as she stomped her designer heels into the gravel, leaving little imprints like angry footprints. She threatened to call the sheriff, and I told her to go right ahead, because I'd be happy to explain how her trespassing car blocked critical farm equipment access, and how my tractor just happened to be a bit too strong for her little toy. That shut her up for a second, but I could see the wheels turning behind her eyes. Karen wasn't the type to rely on law and order. She preferred manipulation, gossip, and bureaucracy. She stormed back to her Range Rover, slamming the door so hard it made the cows in the pasture jump, and sped off down the lane like a bat out of hell. I knew this was only round one. Sure enough, the next day, I received a thick envelope from the HOA stuffed into my mailbox. The letter inside was full of pompous legalese, accusing me of willful destruction of a neighbor's property, failure to maintain neighborhood harmony, and endangerment of community safety. They demanded I attend an emergency meeting the following week where they would decide upon sanctions, fines, or other disciplinary measures. I almost laughed at how absurd it was. The HOA had no real authority over my farm since technically my land wasn't part of their suburban subdivision. I'd been grandfathered in long before the HOA existed. They liked to pretend they had control, though, and Karen had clearly convinced them they did. That same afternoon, I spotted Karen standing at the end of her driveway with two of the HOA board members pointing dramatically toward my barn like some kind of prosecutor laying out a case. Every now and then, she'd throw her head back, clutch her pearls, and pretend to dab at her eyes with a tissue as though I had personally assaulted her instead of a hunk of metal on wheels. The board members nodded gravely, taking notes, and I realized Karen wasn't just after revenge. She wanted to use this incident to force me out, to erase that eyesore farmer from her picture-perfect neighborhood. I wasn't about to give her the satisfaction. The night before the emergency HOA meeting, I gathered up every bit of documentation I had. The posted no parking signs, photographs of the barn blocked by the Bentley, the timestamped voicemail I left on her phone asking her to move the car, and even a statement from my neighbor Joe, who had witnessed her driving up and parking there in the first place. By the time I walked into that meeting, I was armed like a lawyer going into battle. The room was packed with HOA board members, Karen in the front row with a smug smile plastered across her face, and several curious neighbors who had heard about the barn door Bentley massacre. The meeting started with Karen theatrically presenting her case, waving around glossy photos of her mangled car like evidence in a murder trial. She called me reckless, violent, and a danger to the neighborhood children, which was ironic considering she didn't even have kids. The board members nodded along, clearly swayed by her performance. When it was my turn, I stood, unfolded the photos of her car blocking my barn, and laid out the timeline step by step. I showed the signs clearly posted, read my voicemail transcript aloud, and even played the audio on speaker so the whole room could hear me politely asking her to move her car before I resorted to drastic measures. A murmur rippled through the crowd, and Karen's face twisted with fury. Then I produced Joe's sign statement, which confirmed that Karen had intentionally parked in front of my barn after loudly declaring she was going to teach me a lesson. That was the nail in the coffin. The HOA president, a stiff old man who usually sided with whoever shouted the loudest, cleared his throat and admitted that while the incident was unfortunate, the board could not hold me responsible for damages caused when I was attempting to access my own property. Karen's mouth fell open. She tried to protest, But the room had already turned on her. Neighbors whispered, some laughed, and one even clapped quietly in the back before being shushed. The smug confidence she had strutted in with melted away, leaving her seething and humiliated. As I walked out of that meeting, she hissed at me under her breath, "This isn't over." I didn't doubt her. Karen was the kind of person who, once embarrassed, would stop at nothing to claw back her sense of superiority. But as far as I was concerned, I had won the first real battle, and I was ready for whatever ridiculous move she tried next. In the days that followed the HOA meeting, I could practically feel the storm clouds gathering over my farm, and every time I glanced down the lane toward Karen's mansion-like house, I half expected to see her standing there with binoculars, plotting her next move. Sure enough, it didn't take long for her to retaliate. She started small at first, with the kind of petty harassment you'd expect from a middle school bully rather than a grown woman with 2 luxury vehicles and a yard full of overpriced landscaping. One morning, I found a handwritten note taped to my mailbox, scrawled in red marker, demanding I cease all aggressive farming operations because the sound of my tractor was traumatizing her dogs. Another day, she left an anonymous complaint with animal control, claiming my cows were malnourished and neglected, which resulted in an officer visiting the farm, only to laugh when he saw the herd grazing happily in a lush green pasture, fat and healthy. Then she escalated by calling the county to report that my barn was a fire hazard and that I was storing flammable materials improperly. I spent an entire afternoon walking a safety inspector through the barn, pointing out the brand new extinguishers I'd installed and the fireproof storage cabinets clearly labeled. The inspector actually complimented my setup and even asked for tips to pass along to other farmers. Each time she tried to trip me up, it backfired, and every failed attempt only seemed to make her more desperate. But Karen was persistent, and persistence paired with spite is a dangerous combination. About a week later, I woke up before dawn to the sound of honking horns. I stepped outside, coffee in hand, and found a convoy of delivery trucks lined up down my drive, each one loaded with things I never ordered: a truck full of sod rolls, a crate of pink flamingo lawn ornaments, even a delivery of 30 pizzas paid cash on delivery with my name forged on the slip. The drivers were irritated, and I spent hours sorting out the mess, refusing deliveries, and sending them on their way. I knew exactly who was behind it, and when I glanced down toward Karen's house, I swore I caught a flicker of movement in an upstairs window, like she was watching gleefully as her chaos unfolded. My patience was wearing thin. I wasn't the kind of man to go crying to authorities every time a neighbor acted out, but it was clear she wouldn't stop until she either broke me or drove me out. That night, I sat on my porch watching the fireflies dance across the fields and thought about my options. I could retaliate again, but I had to be smart, smarter than just crushing another car, though I admit the thought did bring a smile to my face. I needed something that would make her understand that her antics weren't just irritating, they were dangerous, and they wouldn't be tolerated. Fate, as it happened, gave me the perfect opportunity. A few days later, a storm rolled through, heavy rain pounding the fields and turning the dirt roads into mud. Early the next morning, I heard the unmistakable sound of a car engine revving and tires spinning, followed by frustrated shouting. When I walked down toward the road, I found Karen's Range Rover buried axle deep in mud at the edge of my property, the rear wheels spinning helplessly as she floored the gas. She had apparently tried to cut across the edge of my field to avoid a flooded ditch on her driveway, and in doing so, she trespassed straight into my land and got herself stuck. I could have left her there, let her stew in her own mistake until a tow truck came, but an idea sparked in my head. I waved, all friendly-like, and shouted, "Need some help?" She glared daggers at me, her pride clearly warring with her desperation. Finally, she snapped, "Yes, fine, just get me out of here." I walked back to the barn, fired up the tractor, and drove it down to where she was stranded. I hooked up a heavy chain to her SUV, but instead of pulling her back onto the road like she expected, I shifted gears and dragged her car deeper into the field, towing it across the mud until it was right in front of my barn doors, the very spot where her precious Bentley had met its demise. She screamed, flailed her arms, and pounded on the steering wheel, but there was nothing she could do but sit there as her pristine white vehicle was coated in mud and straw. When I finally unhooked the chain, I leaned out of the cab and said, "Funny how your cars always seem to end up blocking my barn. Maybe it's a habit?" Her face twisted with rage, and for a moment I thought she might actually explode. But before she could spit out whatever venom she was about to hurl, I added, "Don't worry, I'll let you call a tow truck. But next time, you can pay me for the inconvenience." Then I tipped my hat, turned the tractor around, and went about my chores, leaving her to stew in the mess she had created. That incident sent ripples through the neighborhood. Word spread fast about how Karen had been dragged across my field, and while she tried to spin the story in her favor, claiming I deliberately humiliated her, the truth was that most folks were tired of her antics and secretly delighted to see her get a taste of her own medicine. The balance of power had shifted again, and though I knew Karen wasn't finished, I also knew she was running out of cards to play. But if there was one thing I'd learned about her, it was that she never gave up without a final, desperate swing, and I had the uneasy feeling that swing was coming sooner rather than later. After the Range Rover incident, Karen went quiet for a few days, which should have been a relief, but instead it made me uneasy. Silence from someone like her wasn't peace, it was plotting. I kept working my fields, tending the animals, and running my farm, but every time I saw her house at the end of the lane, with its manicured hedges and ostentatious fountains, I imagined her pacing back and forth behind those tall windows, scheming. Sure enough, the storm broke one Friday evening when I came back from hauling hay to find a bright orange notice stapled to my barn door. It was an official-looking document stamped with county seals declaring that my barn was under investigation for zoning and code violations and that I had to cease operations immediately pending inspection. My blood boiled the moment I read it. Karen must have called in some bogus complaint and twisted it into official action, and now she had dragged the county into her personal vendetta. I knew my barn was up to code. I had renovated it myself just last year, passed every inspection, and filed all the permits. But still, the threat of bureaucratic red tape shutting down my livelihood made me see red. The next morning, two county inspectors showed up, clipboards in hand, looking sheepish as they explained that they had received multiple complaints about unsafe wiring, improper animal housing, and unpermitted equipment storage. I gave them a full tour, showing off the electrical system I'd had professionally installed, the spacious stalls for the animals, and the meticulously organized storage racks. They checked everything, took their notes, and by the end, both men admitted it was one of the safest, cleanest barns they'd inspected all year. They promised to file their report clearing me of any violations, but they couldn't resist sharing a detail. They'd been flooded with calls from the same number, all anonymous but clearly traced back to the same source. I didn't need them to spell out who that source was. Karen wasn't even trying to hide anymore. Furious as I was, I realized I had an advantage. Her obsession with trying to destroy me was leaving a trail, and trails can be followed. Later that week, I got a call from my lawyer friend, Tom, who lived a few towns over and happened to specialize in property disputes. I'd sent him a copy of the bogus notice and explained the situation, and he wasted no time digging into the pattern of complaints. By cross-referencing dates and phone records, he confirmed what I already knew. Every single one had been made by Karen, often within minutes of one another, as though she were hammering the phone in a fit of rage. Tom told me it was enough to file a harassment claim, maybe even seek damages for interference with my business. The idea of dragging Karen into court was tempting, but part of me wanted to handle it the old-fashioned way, direct, personal, and without lawyers. Still, I kept the paperwork tucked away as a weapon for later. Karen, however, wasn't finished. The very next evening, as I sat down for dinner, the power on my property suddenly went out. At first, I thought it was just a storm-related outage, but when I stepped outside, I noticed that the streetlights down the lane were still on and the neighboring houses still glowed with electricity. Suspicion prickled the back of my neck. I grabbed a flashlight and followed the line down toward the road, and sure enough, I found that someone had tampered with my breaker box, pulling wires loose and leaving the cover hanging open. It didn't take a detective to figure out who the culprit was. She had gone from petty complaints and sabotage to outright vandalism. That was the last straw. The next morning, I marched straight down her driveway, past the ridiculous lion statues guarding her front steps, and pounded on the door until she answered. She appeared in silk pajamas, holding a coffee cup like she'd just stepped out of a catalog photo shoot, and raised one eyebrow with feigned innocence. "Can I help you?" she asked sweetly, though the smug glint in her eye betrayed her. I didn't bother with pleasantries. "Stay off my property," I growled. "I know it was you messing with my power, and if you ever step foot near my barn or my lines again, I won't just crush your car, I'll press charges." For the first time, I saw a flicker of uncertainty cross her face. It was gone in a second, replaced by a sneer, but it told me something important. She wasn't invincible, no matter how much money or arrogance she hid behind. She snapped back with her usual venom, calling me a deranged hillbilly and promising that I would regret ever moving here. But I just turned and walked away, refusing to let her bait me further. That night, as I sat on the porch watching the sunset, I realized this feud wasn't just about a car or a barn, or even her hatred of farm life. It was about control. Karen wanted to rule the neighborhood like a queen, dictating how everyone else lived, and I was the one person who refused to bow down. That made me her enemy, and she wasn't going to stop until she thought she'd won. But here's the thing. She didn't realize she was playing a long game against someone who lived and breathed long games. Farming teaches you patience, resilience, and the value of hard work. I could outlast her, outthink her, and if it came down to it, outfight her. I leaned back, folded my arms, and made a decision. If Karen wanted war, I was more than ready to give her one, but on my terms, not hers. The insurance adjuster's visit the next week only made things messy, because Karen had already spun her tale into something more dramatic than it actually was. She told anyone who would listen that I'd viciously assaulted her property and that the scene at my barn was evidence of an unhinged neighbor who needed to be removed. When the adjuster showed up at my gate, clipboard in hand and a polite frown on his face, I invited him in, poured him a cup of coffee, and walked him through the evidence like a man showing off a well-tended garden. Photos, timestamps, witness statements, and the tow receipts from the Range Rover escapade. He scribbled notes, nodded a few times, and then, looking me dead in the eye, said something that made my skin crawl. "You understand, sir, that this type of conflict can turn ugly. People get hurt in cases like these." I did understand, and the thought of any neighbor, ours or hers, getting hurt filled me with a cold dread I hadn't felt before. Up until then, most of our exchanges had been humiliating, petty, and at times infuriating, but I'd never wanted anyone to be physically harmed. Still, the idea of letting her keep pushing and pushing until someone's lines crossed unnerved me, so I made a choice. I would play it tighter, smarter, with less anger in my voice and more strategy in my moves. First, I started documenting everything as if I were building a dossier for war: emails, letters, photos, audio recordings where legal, and a daily log of every incident. I learned the exact words to use and avoid in complaints, the right channels to pursue, and when to escalate to authorities rather than confrontation. I talked to the local sheriff and politely explained the pattern of harassment. He listened, promised to keep an eye out, and told me to call immediately if anything crossed the line into criminal behavior. Having law enforcement on standby calmed me a bit, but it didn't stop Karen from continuing her reign of pettiness. She pivoted to a new tactic: social warfare. She started a whisper campaign, slipping tiny lies to neighbors about alleged late-night parties at my property, fictional complaints about odors and waste, and suggested that my farming practices were unsanitary and offensive. The HOA board, some of whom were gossip-prone and fearful of perception, began to take tentative steps again, and I could feel the pressure mounting from the more timid folks who didn't want trouble and would rather I keep my head down. That was the moment I realized the battle lines were not just physical, they were social, and winning required me to show my neighbors who I really was. So I opened my farm up. I hosted a weekend open day, invited everyone on the lane, even Karen if she wished, though she of course did not accept, and I cooked up an old-fashioned barbecue, laid out hay rides for the kids, organized a little tractor pull for fun, and set up a table with fresh eggs, pies, and preserves. The turnout surprised even me. People came curious with questions, with the kind of suspicion that needed the simple balm of a good meal to soothe. As we walked them through the barn, explained our routines, and let the children feed the goats, the whispers turned into conversations, and the conversations turned into friendships. Joe and his wife brought their famous potato salad and stayed until the stars came out, telling anyone who would listen about how I had helped them fix a fence last winter. The sheriff stopped by, too, not in uniform but with an easy grin, and chatted with neighbors about safety and neighborliness in the county. By the time the weekend ended, the mood on the lane had shifted. Folks who had been unsure now saw me as part of the community, not some eccentric outlier. Word traveled fast, and it hurt Karen's cause. She tried to spin this social victory as staged, as a show meant to manipulate opinion, but the neighbors had seen the barn, the animals, and the honest work it took to run a farm. The tide had turned socially, and there was nothing she could do to fake that. That didn't stop her from trying other tactics, though. Humiliated and cornered, she went for the nuclear option, legal and financial harassment designed to choke me out. Over the next month, I started receiving a barrage of notices. Subpoenas related to frivolous suits she'd filed, liens on my property from fabricated disputes with fake contractors she'd hired to inspect my work, and collections calls for services I never ordered. She was trying to bury me in paperwork and fees, hoping a small business like mine would fold under the weight of expense and time. But I had an ace up my sleeve: Tom, my lawyer friend, and a small but stubborn savings account set aside for the farm's lean years. Tom tore into the frivolous suits with the ferocity of a bloodhound, filing motions to dismiss, countersuits for harassment, and requests for sanctions. Each time Karen tried to bully the courts, she found herself answering subpoenas and facing fines for wasting judicial resources. Those legal battles cost her too, both money and reputation, and I watched with a grim satisfaction as her aggressiveness turned inward, her legal maneuvers collapsing like house of cards. Still, even as I felt my strategy paying off, a sense of fatigue seeped in. Battles, even just legal ones, drain you, and I realized I couldn't keep this up forever. There had to be a final resolution, something that would definitively end the feud without either of us losing everything. I mulled over options: selling, moving, negotiated truce, or a dramatic finale. And as the autumn leaves began to turn, I decided on a different tack: leverage. I dug through old property records, easements, and county maps, looking for anything that could swing the balance legally in my favor. What I found, tucked in a dusty folder in the county clerk's office, was an old easement agreement that granted my property the right of way and guaranteed access for agricultural operations dating back decades, long before Karen's house was even built. It was a dusty relic in black and white, but in the hands of a patient, organized farmer, it was dynamite. Armed with that document, written in careful legalese and signed by officials long gone, I felt the scales tip decisively back to my side. The next time Karen tried to rally the HOA or press some new complaint, I would not only be ready, I would be untouchable in certain respects. It felt good, not because I wanted to humiliate her further, but because the law finally was on my side. For the first time since the Bentley, I slept without that low hum of dread in my chest. I still didn't trust her. I knew she'd try one last desperate move. But now I had a plan, paperwork, allies, and a community who'd seen me for what I was: a hard-working neighbor who loved his land. The chessboard was set, and I was ready to make the next move.